Are we audible? Great. Well, thank you for sticking with it. I'm like between you and the DJ. So I'm Aisha. I work at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, as they say. And we are a center that looks at the social science of AI, like what is going on to our societies, to our people, when we use these sort of models. And I'm going to take a tour through some of the pros and cons, mainly the cons of generative AI, let's be real. But I will try and leave you on a positive note, maybe. We'll see. See what you guys think. So I think first, to understand this, we have to know how generative AI models work. And this is my favorite little diagram. So I hope there's no data scientists in the audience. But it starts with lots of images that all look the same, or they don't necessarily look the same. It starts with lots of images with text pairs. And this is my example, a green and blue robot. The diffusion models, because they diffuse them, take them apart and take them apart and take them apart in multiple layers until you're left with lots of teeny tiny bits of data that are statistically or probabilistically linked to the words that were paired with them at the beginning. This then creates an amalgamated pool of information that at the point at which the user types in a green and blue robot, it goes into this this pool of data and pulls out the most probabilistic outcome, a green and blue robot. Really simple, right? I mean, this is very simplified. All these models have various layers of extra code which decide how the aesthetic of the thing will look, whether it will be kind of like a demon or horror or really beautiful. But this is the kind of the core principle of what is the foundation of all of these models. So, unsurprisingly, because they work by producing the most likely outcome based on a prompt, they make an average of the data that's gone in. AI has therefore been likened to a mirror, reflecting societal biases and acting as a disclosing agent for assumptions about humanness, or a mirror to our popular social systems. But does this averaging or most likely output matter? And I'm going to argue that absolutely, yes, it does. Because the foundation of most of these models is the Lion 5B dataset. This was data that was scraped and taken from the internet against copyright and ownership of artists. And when we think about what was made up of what's on our internet at the moment, we know that that's largely Western, largely white, largely kind of people living their best lives and showing off and trying to show that their lives are good. But it's also made up of, depending on which statistic you believe, of 80 to 20% of pornography. So when that's the foundation of what's going in, including indecent images of children, what comes out, even though it's technically been guardrailed to try and stop bad outputs coming out, has the foundation and has the averaging property of lots of the kind of people living their best lives, which is what we see in lots of the models. And this is why I would argue the dataset diversity matters as in a first point, because if all of our images are green and blue robots on the left living their best life, then all the different green and blue robots on the other end get missed out of the things that come out of the models. And this is a really good example. This is my favorite example of a philosopher. So these models, the link between to show a picture of 9 philosophers, it also shows they can't count, but it shows all men, lots of white beards, and when they were asked for getting ready for a girls' night out, the idea of a kind of female-presenting person as a philosopher was just not in the data set, so it just couldn't do it. But it got the curlers, so that's what's important. And then so lots of fantastic organizations have shown how AI reduces the world to stereotypes. Rest of World analyzed over 3,000 images and identified how they really were quite reductive in the findings of some of these countries. So a Mexican person is usually a man in a sombrero. And this was true for the streets of Delhi always were covered in trash because that's what our sort of internet pictures of New Delhi streets were. And this average of all these kind of like complex cultures is just a bit of nothing really, or very stereotypical. And while stereotypes can be useful, it helps us code and immediately kind of figure out what's going on in an image, they can also be really harmful. And then, so why does what we see matter? So people who've been researching visuals and aesthetics have suggested that power revolves around what we see, who has the ability to see and the talent to speak, which basically it kind of like shapes what we think is normal, what is expected, what is good. And before we go any further, I just want to put a caveat in, of course, categories of people are really problematic. Historically, categories have been used for horrible things, eugenics, wars, domination, etc. But they are useful in the sense for auditing as we go through because it highlights who's left out and what's left out as well. And this is why diversity is also important, of course. I hope I'm speaking to a room that agrees. We all hold implicit and explicit biases, but when we kind of see something that's different, when we see something that is not what we're expected, we learn from that, we grow, we become less biased. That's in my opinion, good. We do generally like to see and be with people that are similar to us, share a family, a location, an upbringing, for example, but it enriches our environment and generally, I think, makes a better society. And we can argue that bad representation is anywhere. The Blechdale-Wallace test was a joke measure that also applies to all of these films, that there's no women in these films talking to another woman about anything other than a man for longer than 5 minutes. And it doesn't mean these films are bad, it just means the dominant things we're seeing are stories about predominantly male people. And this is where I'm going to sort of start talking about body size and diversity, which was what I promised on the tin. So scholars like Lupton have argued that the fat body has become the focus of stigmatizing discourses and practices aimed at disciplining, regulating, and containing it. And this isn't new. In parallel with sort of the earlier speaker from this session, this is a movement that began in like the 1970s, and it opposes the science. Fat Studies opposes the science of reduction, health objectification of fat bodies as problems, and rejects the profiteering from fat bodies, which is important, and we'll come to that later. But aesthetically, lots of scholars have kind of argued that our collective taste in bodies is geared towards not liking fat people. To summarize this quote. It's geared towards, and that in part creates the subjectification of those bodies because they're marginalized, stigmatized, and told that they're not as good as the others. But this isn't just a problem for fat people. This is also a problem for like our entire society because body image research is showing that preschool children are worrying if they're too fat and they can't play with their peers, that we've got rising rates of eating disorders, and studies into eating disorders and body image have shown our online spaces and the imagery we encounter really impacts whether we've got these problems going on. And I would argue that we are losing a generation of people to spending time and energy thinking about what they look like and their body size as opposed to doing things that bring them pleasure. But this isn't new. This isn't generative AI's fault necessarily. We had the 90s heroin chic where this isn't new, but it's definitely, I would argue it's amplifying. So what is the generative AI averaging thing that we talked about earlier doing in the world? And this is where I think there's a fantastic scholar from disability studies who talks about the normate. The normate is what isn't just what's normal for each of us. We each have a normal. But the normate is a product and functions through societal expectations. And for scholars like Reynolds, they add that this implies an ought. So I ought to be thin, I ought to be beautiful, I ought to go on a run, I ought to wash my hair, I ought. And then the normate is unachievable. No one is the normate, because it's this ideal that is not tangible, it's not get-cuable. So it impacts everyone, even the people who are, by our societal standards, really beautiful, really almost there. There's still something that with the goalposts changing, there's always a trying to achieve. But the closer you are, the more power you have to this ideal. That's the idea of the normate. So I argue that generative AI images are starting to communicate the normate and the normate body. And this research kind of like, if you put in a disabled American woman, you get a hypersexualized, so this is GenCraft, hypersexualized, really patriotic person who has, the American flag on their prosthetic. And these hypersexualized images, when we think about what's created the internet, it kind of makes sense. And I'm going to caveat here, I don't know what I would like to see, but I know this probably isn't it. Similarly, if you ask for a disabled queer person, they really like flags. Queer is the only time you ever tend to get tattoos, which is quite interesting. And neither of these images are necessarily bad images, but I also don't think this is what we should only be seeing when we ask for these sort of things. So this prompted me to do a larger study, and I wanted to understand how the fat body was created in generative AI images. First of its kind, just saying. So I used 20 prompts across 9 different free-to-use generative AI models to try and get some trends throughout. 11 of those prompts indicated a larger body size. So a person, a fat person, an obese person. Though I predominantly use fat because that was the reclaimed word that I'm going to stick with. 9 prompts were only person. So a person having fun dancing with friends, a person in their house, etc. And I undertook some analysis of what came out, and this is what I'm going to share with you guys now. So this was the study, and I found that if not explicitly prompted, none of the models would show fatness or disability without being prompted. So what they were creating was inherently very thin, very sample-sized people, which again makes sense if you think about all the advertising that is on our kind of online media that has gone in to create the models. But it also found that when I asked for larger body sizes, the images started to get a bit weird. So the models were producing images that contravened their own content guidelines, lots of nakedness, fewer positive facial expressions, higher rates of mistakes, so anomalies in kind of like body autonomy that just kind of don't make sense. So you kind of, where has this come from? You could kind of see some sort of sumo wrestling poses in and amongst the images that you were getting. And more often than not, it tended to be a kind of a white topless man as the fat person with very similar face across lots of the models. So it was a really interesting, if problematic, study. So this is the kind of images that were coming out when you asked for a person. So a person exercising, a person dancing, having fun with friends, a person in their house, just a person. And these were all kind of relatively smiley, relatively bright. Some of them, I would argue, or most, if not all of these people represent the model ideal of a body. But you did get some interesting age variation, which is a kind of a development on earlier age models with age bias. When you asked for a fat person, this is what kind of happened. And this is sort of some of the body anomalies I was talking about. You would get kind of additional roles, additional kind of splits, lots of just toplessness, sometimes happy to the kind of manically happy. And I would say I don't see myself in these images, which is like part of the ethnographic way of doing this. So can we fix the system? This is the question that comes to us now. Can we fix it? An existing solution that's gone into lots of the the image models we have at the moment to support more age and racial diversity has been to add diversity prompts. So this is, if you don't ask for a specific type of racial characteristic in your prompt, within the code that underlies the retrieval of the image and creation of the image from the kind of big pool of data, it adds in a prompt of the prompts for racial diversity. However, this example from Gemini, which was the latest release of Google's image model, shows how there's some problems with this because it's when does history stop? These sort of images created quite an outcry online. Some of it justified, some of it, because the internet's not a nice place sometimes. But the technical solution to this really social problem and like trying to tweak the end point when the foundations are so flawed, I think we can sort of, if we rule this one out, because it's not necessarily going to help, especially because if loads of images of fat people and disabled people doing diverse things, having a good life are missing, then they need to be sourced from somewhere. What happens? Are we going to be paid? I highly doubt it. So do we just increase dataset diversity to try and fix the problem? And this is where some sort of really critical scholars of AI technologies come in, and they sort of say, well, if the original point of the system is to be carceral, to surveil, to control people in some way, then efforts to increase your dataset diversity merely only incorporate marginalized people and subjugate them into more systems of oppression. This example is from people of color in a carceral setting. There's also questions of generative AI image labor. So AI Empire is an absolutely fantastic article that talks about the global supply chain that goes into our generative AI systems. This article evidences the exploitation at so many different points of this chain, and we as users don't see it, but it's there. And similarly, if we try and clean up our data sets, if we remove the pornography, we remove the things that we think are bad, the emotional labor that gets outsourced to people in the rest of the world is starting to be evidenced to have a really harsh psychological toll. Recently, there have been a few exposés on the conditions of this work, taking women with kids away from their families, promising lots of money, taking them to a different country and having them work for 12 hours a day, scrolling through horrendous images. It's not nice. And equally, there's loads of power use that goes into generative AI, especially the larger the model, the more data. So if we add more data, it makes it worse. Each image tends to use about a cell phone's battery's worth of power. So with all of this better, maybe we don't want to make the data sets bigger and better because we've still got so many issues with the system itself. So what else can we do? And this is where I think there are some really and I have to hold on to these because I do research about how bad these systems are, some really hopeful examples of creating dialogue and creating awareness of the things that go into these systems, even if it's not fixing the system itself. So Archival Images of AI has been trying to highlight the historical labor that's gone into AI systems. And this is an example, I don't know if you guys can see, but so this is Alan Turing. He was one of the foundational people of AI. And in a shadow underneath is a shadow of a woman. And this is highlighting all of the kind of the labor that's gone into these systems that we just don't see, the shadow work. Similarly, there are more resistant and harsher options. We've got data poisoning and glaze from Ben Zhao's team and Heather Zhang. So nightshade or data poisoning lets image creators and image owners incorporate a small part of code into the image so that if it's scraped offline, it goes into the larger model and makes it break in unpredictable ways. So hands are feet, and cats are dogs, to very kind of simple ways, all the way through to kind of just breaking the model. And it's really hard to fix or find because these extra bits of data aren't findable at the moment by a different AI algorithm. So the owners of the models have to go through and have to look for the bit of code that's wrong in their model. And similarly, there are glaze, which allows people to mask their own style. And this is where I think resistance in silence or resistance in not being seen is actually really is something we need to grapple with. For me, sometimes not being able to see myself in generative AI images is actually a really good thing, because it means that people who look like me have not been exploited, that their images haven't been taken, and we've not been seen by this overwhelmingly capitalist system. Sometimes maybe we need to sit in discomfort about how these outputs are created and critically reflect on what's being produced. If this is a mirror of our society, then are the images that are coming out what we want to see? Is that who we want to be? And I'm using a royal we here. I'm not sure who's going to exactly fix this. But this is where building small might come in. Representative and community-based models that could produce better body diversity because the images would be owned by the community themselves. They would also be less resource intensive to run, and they could do a really good job, but someone's got to go out and build that, right? So I hope I've left you guys thinking on not completely negative, though it is tempting. Thank you for listening, and I think there's a few minutes for questions now, or I'm happy to chat later if anyone's interested.
Thank you.